Ever heard of a war that went on for like almost half a century?
Yeah.
But the main players never actually directly fought each other in any big battles.
Sounds a little unusual, right?
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. We're talking about the Cold War, of course, and it really did kind of shape the world we live in today, even though it ended a while back.
Definitely a period worth understanding. Lots of twists and turns and surprising impacts.
Exactly. So today, we're going to take a deep dive into the whole Cold War thing. You're using all the materials and stuff we've got laid out for us. We'll go back to the beginning, see how this whole thing started, then look at some of the key conflicts, even though it wasn't like a typical war. And then, of course, we have to talk about all the crazy technology that came out of it, and then, wrap it up by seeing how it still affects us today.
All within a reasonable time frame, too. Got to be mindful of everyone's time these days.
For sure. So buckle up, because we're about to go deep into this Cold War business. First things first, Faye. What exactly are we talking about when we say Cold War? It wasn't like World War II with clear battle lines and all that.
Right. It was this really long global standoff between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, basically. From the end of World War II in 1945 all the way to 1991. A lot of people don't realize it went on for that long.
Wow. Okay, so almost 50 years. But if they weren't, actually fighting, what were they doing all that time?
Well, it was this constant struggle, but it was fought through politics and economics and this constant threat of military action. But they never actually went head-to-head in a big way.
I see. So a lot of tension, but no, big explosions, thankfully.
Mhm.
So what was at the heart of this whole thing? Why were they at each other's throats for all those years?
Basically, it boils down to this clash of ideologies. The U.S. was all about democracy and capitalism, right?
Mhm.
Individual freedom, free markets, that whole deal.
Yeah, that's kind of their thing.
Exactly. But the Soviet Union was totally different. They were all about communism, which means the government controls pretty much everything, the economy, the political system, the whole shebang.
So completely opposite ways of looking at the world.
You got it. And this difference went way beyond just talk. It shaped how they saw the future of Europe after World War II. The U.S. wanted to see democratic governments and free elections everywhere. But the Soviets, well, they wanted to spread their influence and create a buffer zone of communist countries in Eastern Europe.
Basically, they wanted to protect themselves after all the craziness of World War II, right?
Exactly. They'd suffered massive losses, and they saw these satellite states as a way to kind of shield themselves from any future attacks. So you had this fundamental disagreement that kind of became the heart of the Cold War.
And that's where the whole divided Germany thing comes in, right?
Yeah.
With the Berlin Wall and everything, like a physical manifestation of this ideological divide.
Absolutely. I mean, imagine a city literally split in half by a wall. It was a powerful symbol of how the world was divided at that time.
Crazy. So this ideological battle was intense, but then there was this whole other layer of scary stuff, right? The nuclear weapons.
Oh, yeah, that was a huge part of it. Both sides were building up these massive stockpiles of nuclear weapons. It was this insane arms race.
Like who could build the biggest bomb kind of thing.
Pretty much. And the idea was that if one side launched a nuclear attack, the other side would immediately retaliate. It was this concept called mutually assured destruction, or MNE.
MAD. That pretty much sums it up right.
Yeah.
It's terrifying to think about how close we came to nuclear war.
Definitely. And probably the closest we got was during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962.
Oh, yeah, that was a nail-biter. I remember reading about it. The Soviets put nuclear missiles in Cuba basically right on America's doorstep.
And the U.S. obviously wasn't too happy about that. They set up a naval blockade around Cuba, and for 13 days, the world was on the brink of nuclear war. Like, everybody was holding their breath.
It's amazing it didn't escalate further. How did they manage to pull back from the edge like that?
A lot of intense negotiations behind the scenes. In the end, the Soviets agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba, and secretly, the U.S. also agreed to remove some of their missiles from Turkey. It was this really delicate balancing act to prevent things from spiraling out of control.
So we had the ideological battle, the threat of nuclear annihilation, and then there's this whole other competition, the space race. It's like they took their rivalry to a whole new level.
It's fascinating, isn't it? The space race was this incredible display of technological prowess and a way for both sides to demonstrate their superiority on the world stage.
Definitely. And it all started with Sputnik, right? The Soviets launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite, in 1957. That was a huge shock to the U.S.
Absolutely. It was like a wake-up call that the Soviets were ahead in this new technological frontier. And then just a few years later, Yuri Gagarin, a Soviet cosmonaut, became the first human to orbit the Earth, another major win for them.
So the U.S. had some catching up to do. And they did right. With the moon landing and all that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They poured tons of resources into their space program. And in 1969, Neil Armstrong became the first person to walk on the moon. It was a defining moment of the 20th century, a huge victory for the U.S. and a symbol of their technological dominance.
Makes you wonder what kind of crazy tech we'd have now if they hadn't been competing so fiercely.
Absolutely. The space race pushed both sides to innovate at an incredible pace. It led to all sorts of technological breakthroughs: satellites, advanced computing systems, even material science. A lot of the tech we take for granted today has roots in the Cold War space programs, like GPS, for example.
So while they weren't fighting directly, they were still involved in conflicts around the world,
Yeah,
supporting different sides. It's like fighting by proxy, right?
exactly. These were the proxy wars, conflicts where the US and the Soviet Union would back opposing sides without actually sending their own troops in large numbers. It was a way to influence events without risking a direct confrontation, which could have led to, a nuclear war.
Makes sense. So they were playing a dangerous game, but trying to keep it contained. And there were some major proxy wars during the Cold War, right? Like Korea and Vietnam.
Absolutely. The Korean War, which started in 1950, was a major flashpoint. You had communist North Korea, backed by the Soviets, and China invading South Korea, which was
Oh, yeah.
supported by the US and the UN.
So pretty classic Cold War showdown.
Definitely. And it ended in a stalemate with Korea permanently divided into two countries, a lasting legacy of the Cold War.
And then there was Vietnam. That was a long and painful conflict for the U.S.
The Vietnam War was another proxy war where the U.S. got heavily involved trying to prevent the communist North Vietnamese from taking over South Vietnam.
And it didn't really go well for the U.S., did it?
It was a complex and costly conflict that ultimately ended in a U.S. withdrawal and a unified communist Vietnam. The Vietnam War really highlighted the limitations of U.S. power and the human cost of these proxy wars.
And these weren't the only places where the Cold War played out right. It seemed like they were meddling in conflicts all over the globe.
You're absolutely right. Both the U.S. and the Soviet Union were involved in supporting various factions and governments in places like Afghanistan, Latin America, and parts of Africa. It was this global chessboard where they were constantly vying for influence.
So the Cold War wasn't just this one big standoff. It was this tangled web of conflicts and interventions.
Exactly. And it had a profound impact on countries around the world.
So how did this whole thing finally end? After almost 50 years of tension and fear, what led to the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Well, by the 1980s, the Soviet Union was facing some serious internal problems. Their economy was struggling, people were unhappy with the lack of freedoms, and there was a growing sense that the communist system wasn't working.
Sounds like things were starting to unravel.
Exactly. And then in 1985, a new leader came to power, Mikhail Gorbachev. And he tried to reform the Soviet system with these policies called glasnost and perestroika.
Glasnost and perestroika, those are some serious Russian words. What were they all about?
Glasnost basically meant openness, more transparency in government. And perestroika was about restructuring the economy, trying to make it more efficient.
So basically, Gorbachev was trying to fix things, save the Soviet Union.
In a way, yes. But ironically, these reforms ended up weakening the Communist Party's control, especially in Eastern Europe.
So these reforms kind of backfired.
You could say that. People in Eastern Europe saw what was happening in the Soviet Union, and they started demanding more freedoms and reforms of their own.
And that's when the Berlin Wall came down.
Right.
One of the most iconic moments of the 20th century.
November 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. It was a truly symbolic event, the end of an era. And just a couple of years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved into multiple independent countries.
The end of the Cold War. A huge turning point in history. So even though it's been over for a while, its legacy lives on, right? Like we're still dealing with some of the consequences today.
Absolutely. The Cold War shaped the geopolitical landscape in ways that are still felt today. We still have nuclear weapons. We still have tensions between Russia and the West. And the technological advancements that were spurred by the Cold War continue to influence our lives in countless ways.
It's amazing to think about how this conflict that was never really a full-blown war had such a lasting impact.
It really shows you that power isn't just about military might. It's also about ideas, economics, and technology. And the Cold War was a perfect example of how these things can be used to shape the world.
So to sum up this whole Cold War saga, we had two superpowers with radically different ideologies locked in this global standoff for almost half a century. It was a time of intense fear with the constant threat of nuclear war. But it also pushed both sides to achieve incredible technological feats, like putting a man on the moon. And even though the Cold War is over, its legacy continues to shape our world today.
Absolutely. And it leaves us with a really important question to ponder. How are these same dynamics playing out today? The competition for influence, the rapid pace of technological change, the struggle between different ideologies, these things are still happening, but maybe on different battlefields. It's something worth thinking about as we navigate the complexities of the 21st century.
So much to unpack there. That was a great deep dive. We covered a lot of ground. Thanks for taking this journey with us. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the past because it really does shape the present.
You got it. Always happy to delve into these historical moments. It's fascinating to see how it all connects.
And on that note, we'll see you next time for another deep dive into history.
See you then.